amazing workers and thinkers, and they really distinguish themselves in a sea of mediocrity from a lot of other institutions. And then also, yes, so good work all Hillsdale students, but my husband and I send our kids to a classical Lutheran school that is also staffed by quite a few Hillsdale graduates, and my daughter's 5th grade teacher has been directing her recently in memorizing the entirety of Pericles' funeral oration, which is, not what a lot of 5th graders are doing. And she and one of her classmates recently were encouraged to draw an illustrated children's Odyssey so that the younger students at the school could learn the joys of the Odyssey. And then my 3rd grader, her teacher is also a Hillsdale grad, and she has just made Greek mythology so exciting for this 3rd grader, and my daughter recently made a board game based on the lives of Greek gods and goddesses, and we pay our kids money based on whether they answer Jeopardy questions correctly or not. And so she is just really doing well in the mythology category, and 10 cents each time. It's very exciting. But I just want to thank you for your support of this institution that has meant so much to my husband and me, and in our work and in our lives. And also, as I mentioned, I went to University of Colorado, and I am a native, a very proud native of Colorado, and I know that many of you here are from Colorado. To the extent that when people ask me where I'm from, I still say Colorado, and I haven't actually lived here in 20 years. But I just refuse to accept the idea that I'm from anywhere other than Colorado. And my parents live in Douglas County, and my sister's in Denver, and I have a large extended family here. So it is so nice to be in beautiful Colorado, and I hope you all appreciate the beautiful place that you get to live as well. A little different in Virginia. Also a pretty place, but no mountains and none of the lifestyle and beauty that you all have here. So, okay. On Monday night, I was on Special Report. TV is not my natural medium, as you probably can figure out. I prefer to write. And breaking news is a particularly stressful situation. I like to think about what I'm going to say and then write it out and then rewrite what I'm going to say. Well, on Monday, that was when the special counsel referred some wrongdoing to a local FBI branch, and they raided the president's personal attorney's offices, home, and hotel room to seize all these things. And we were being asked to respond to it in real time. And I was actually having a lot of fun with it, because this is one of those stories that I have been following quite a bit. I have very different thoughts on everything than most people in DC about this larger story. So it was fun to respond, but it was also just so surreal. We were watching the president speak about the violation of civil liberties and what a disgrace it is that's going on. And I almost felt like I was outside myself, understanding this is a really serious moment in time. And it's really just so surreal to have a president who just says what's on his mind, for better or for worse. He just says what's on his mind, and he just sort of says things that you don't expect a politician to say. But what's weird about the moment is also that we have a media that distorts what's happening. And that also contributes to these feelings of surrealism that I think a lot of people are experiencing. They sort of see what's going on with their own eyes, and then they listen to a media distort and contextualize things in a way that doesn't match with reality. So I was reading a story about Chuck Todd in Politico recently, and it was built around how the president had used very intemperate rhetoric to personally attack him, calling him a son of a something. And Chuck Todd had this quote that just stuck with me. He said, "Our credibility is being challenged now by the president. And maybe it's a tactic, maybe it's the same old, but one of their strongest arrows in their quiver is the media's coverage of the Iraq War. And so we can't afford to get a big story wrong basically twice in a decade, twice in, I guess, a generation." He went on, "The collective press corps' coverage of Vietnam and Watergate gave the media its credibility." Interesting perspective, I don't know. He said, "If we blow this moment, it could be something that we'll pay a price for a generation." And I'm sitting there thinking, Yes, Chuck Todd, that would be very bad for your credibility if you blew a really big story, such as, oh, I don't know, the entire 2016 campaign and election. That would be really bad. And to like pretend like that didn't happen and to pretend that people didn't notice what was going on. I mean, how many times was there this media consensus about what was going on that didn't match with reality, as evidenced by the result of the election? But even if the election hadn't gone that way, it would have been just as true that the media were telling a false story, because it was a close enough election that they could have sort of gotten away with it. But rather than responding to that humiliating and discrediting coverage of 2016 with a genuine admission of guilt, a return to fact-based reporting as opposed to narrative pushing, and making systematic changes to improve diversity in newsrooms responded instead by getting worse. I mean, it's really weird. You'd think you go through an event like that, you have no option but to admit you need to fix some things. And instead, we've seen media get just more unhinged and more hysterical. Yesterday, a media reporter at CNN was bragging about the chyron of the day at CNN. So a chyron is like at the very bottom of the screen on your TV. It's like a caption or something that describes what's going on. And and so like in recent years, CNN has taken to just using that chyron to attack Republicans, and mostly actually just Trump, to attack Trump. So they'll say, Donald Trump said something, and that's a lie, and they put it in the chyron. And it would be one thing, I mean, I don't think people think of Donald Trump as the most precise rhetorician. So it would be one thing if they were doing that across the board, like if you like your health care plan, you can keep your health care plan, and that's a lie, It'd be one thing if they were doing it for everybody, all politicians, but they just do it mostly with Trump and Republicans. But the one yesterday said, Trump's anger over raid surpasses previous tantrums. That's a really mature chyron that you should brag about putting on your media outlet. I mean, it's weird because CNN, I think, used to be thought of as a media outlet that at least aimed toward objectivity and aimed to have a sort of calm sense about it, and they chose to throw that away. I don't know how that's working out for them. But this was a reference, this supposed tantrum, was a reference to Trump not taking kindly to an out-of-control FBI and Department of Justice raiding the offices of his personal attorney, as you might imagine, might not go over well with people, particularly because attorney-client communications, which are privileged, were seized. That's a serious issue. But our media aren't really interested in exploring those serious issues. Instead of, they just want to do point scoring against Republicans and Trump in particular. Alan Dershowitz, who I think has been an admirable exception to a lot of this, is a genuine liberal who actually believed what he was saying for many years and has been raising concerns about these investigations that don't have a strong legal basis. And he said yesterday in a piece he published, many civil libertarians have remained silent about potential violations of President Trump's rights because they strongly disapprove of him and his policies. That is a serious mistake, because these violations establish precedents that lie around like loaded guns capable of being aimed at other targets. It doesn't take a huge intellect to realize if they can do this to the president, they can do it to you. But we have a one-sided media environment that seems to me to be getting worse every day. Conservative and constitutional viewpoints are throttled, while progressive viewpoints are amplified and coordinated. A couple of weeks ago, one of my colleagues at Fox critiqued one of the children that is being used by anti-gun activists to attack gun rights. She issued an unnecessary tweet. She quickly apologized for her intemperance in a genuine way, but it didn't matter. The people who opposed gun rights refused the apology, and they pressured companies to stop advertising on her show. Now, in an adult world, children telling corporations to bully people for wrongthink would be dismissed as ridiculous. But in our world, the corporations quickly succumbed. It's very reminiscent of what happened just a few weeks prior when Delta Airlines responded to bullying by attacking NRA members and removing a benefit in a very grand display of virtue signaling. And all of this, I think people really need to think about what these stories have in common, which is what actually happened is there was a horrific shooting in Florida where literally dozens of times federal, state, and local authorities were warned about someone who they thought was a problem. And it wasn't even, sometimes the warnings were like, we think this person is violent and a problem. Sometimes the warnings were as specific as, this person with this name is going to shoot up this school with this name. I mean, you can't get a more specific warning than that. And for some reason, the agreed upon response by many people in the media was that the fault lied with NRA members, and that the response to massive catastrophic government failure to defend its citizens should be a removing of rights of self-defense. That's insane. That makes no sense at all, and yet it's actually what you see in most media coverage of what's going on. Yesterday, and today, I guess we were mentioning Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, was testifying on the Hill, and most of the questions were, as Cheryl pointed out, from grandstanding senators with limited knowledge of Facebook or how it works. But I did like the line of questioning from two senators, Ted Cruz of Texas and Ben Sasse of Nebraska, who asked important questions about how Facebook defines safe speech and unsafe speech, and how they understand their role in protecting free speech, and how they have a one-sided crusade regarding speech. The senators pointed out how conservative viewpoints are routinely silenced, while leftist viewpoints are amplified and never silenced. Twitter's CEO, and Twitter is this huge social media platform where a lot of ideas are spread and disseminated, and where a lot of the bullying takes place. The corporations that respond to the bullying by removing advertising are usually just pressured on Twitter. So it's an important medium, even if not a lot of people are on there. So the CEO of Twitter linked approvingly to a threatening article about how the left should just model itself in total after California's left and just destroy the right. Compromise is over, the right simply must be destroyed and silenced. Which is a threatening thing for a social media CEO to say, hey, check this article out. It's really a good read. When you're not in his viewpoint. Despite their numbers, the strength of their arguments, and their political power, conservatism is struggling because every institution in America is making it difficult to get the message out. They distort what we say. They apply double standards. And frequently, just silencing conservatives is the easiest way to deal with us. It's much harder to engage arguments. So, when we think about how we got here, I think people rightly understand that a lot of this happens as a result of what's happening in academia. But I also get a little frustrated when people say, like, how did things happen like this? I was talking with my dear colleague, Charles Krauthammer, many months ago, who was saying that he's been in the punditry business for a really long time, and he's always been predicting doom and gloom if conservative values are not upheld. And he said after a while he was wondering if maybe he wasn't being melodramatic, because it seemed like the country was doing fine. It was wealthy, healthy, people seemed to be largely content. And in recent years he'd come to realize that, in fact, he had been right, that failure to uphold conservative values was having a serious problem for the culture, and that many of the predictions he'd made about moral rot were in fact coming true. I think conservatives should have far more confidence in their predictive powers. Frequently, conservatives predict some bad effect will come about with a change in policy. You can think of thousands of these examples, but think about how there were changes to welfare benefits decades ago where, coming from a good place, people thought that it was unfair that women couldn't get welfare benefits for them and their children unless they were married. So they removed the requirement that you should be married if you're getting welfare benefits for your family. And conservatives said they understand why you would do that, but it might actually result in worse problems if the father is no longer considered integral to a family and he can just kind of check out. Of course, you can imagine what the response was to this line of argument. You people are evil, bigoted, racist. Is there nothing you wouldn't do to hurt poor people? And progressives won the day. Now, of course, we know that not only were the conservatives right, they were more right than they even knew. The situation in terms of family disintegration among lower classes is horrifically bad. Not having fathers involved in the raising of children is causing serious problems for young boys and girls, and we have now decades of data to show this. But there are no apologies offered for all those slurs that were hurled at conservatives. But never mind, my point is conservatives should have more confidence in their predictions. And for decades, conservatives have been warning about the decline of education in government primary schools, as well as in academia. They said it was causing serious problems, turning away from true education and adoption of many progressive ideas. Some have been warning about this at least since the 60s. And then they act surprised when they see what's happening on college campuses. And it is a bad situation right now, and I think it's worth going over a little bit of it. Over 90% of America's top colleges regulate campus free speech. 1/3 employ severely restrictive policies, according to FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, that monitors this. So one of the main ways that this can happen even is through policing of what are called microaggressions. This is where you say something nice, but the argument is that you're actually being racist or sexist. So if you say, I'm impressed that you're majoring in economics, to a woman like myself who majored in economics, that might be sexist because you're implying women can't handle the math. Well, that's silly, but at least you kind of understand what the thinking is there. Other examples are far less defensible, like if you say, America is a land of opportunity, that could be very hurtful to someone who hasn't made it to the top 1% of America. And supposedly this, marginalizes people who haven't had the same success as elites. The idea is completely out of control and infecting the larger popular culture. This week, there was a big brouhaha about The Simpsons, which is a show I don't watch, but my husband, I believe, has every episode memorized. And there is a character, Apu, who in my limited viewing, I believe is far and away the best character on The Simpsons. He runs the convenience store. He is fundamentally decent and honest and hardworking and nice. But a comedian just put out a documentary saying that he's problematic because he reinforces stereotypes about South Indian immigrants to the United States, which I would think, what is the stereotype that they're awesome because Apu is so awesome in this show. But people really decided that this was a real serious problem for The Simpsons. The Simpsons, to their credit, responded in their TV show by dismissing the criticism, which itself then was problematic because they're supposed to know, you're always supposed to respond to people with hurt feelings by catering to those hurt feelings, and they declined to do that. But back on campus, a new Knight Gallup poll shows that 30% of college students favor outright censorship of politically incorrect views. And 30% is bad, but it's really bad when you realize that it was just 22% 8 years ago, or sorry, just 22% 2 years ago. The William F. Buckley program at Yale recently commissioned a survey about attitudes toward free speech on campus. They interviewed 800 students all across the country, and they showed that by a margin of 51% to 36%, students favor their school having speech codes to regulate speech for students and faculty. 63% favor requiring professors to employ trigger warnings to alert students to material that might be discomforting. And I think that you're familiar with trigger warnings, and when it's discussed for people who have legitimate post-traumatic stress disorder, which usually arises from actual trauma, like serving in a war and seeing something really horrific and then struggling upon your return to a non-war society. And you can even argue that to some extent PTSD as diagnosed in the military is itself overly diagnosed, but the idea that being a freshman at Swarthmore requires a trigger warning, no matter how horrendous you think colleges are, I think that's a ridiculous claim to make. And 1/3 of students polled could not identify the First Amendment as the part of the Constitution that dealt with free speech. 35% said that the First Amendment does not protect something they call hate speech, while 30% of self-identified liberal students said the First Amendment is itself outdated. It's not a good situation. So it's a regular case to hear about conservatives, many of whom aren't even really that conservative, getting shouted down when trying to give a speech at a campus. And administrations aren't really doing much to protect these speakers, protect the rights of students who want to listen to these speakers. They're not really doing much at all, with a few notable exceptions. On which note, I get invited to speak at college campuses, and I have yet to be yelled at, and I feel like I'm doing something really wrong. So I'm going to work on that, see what I can do to improve the situation. But I think people need to focus on the bigger picture. Free speech isn't the end of itself. It exists for a much bigger, more important reason, and it's about intellectual freedom and the right of man to seek truth. And when you look at our First Amendment, the one that 30% of college students can't identify what's in it, it looks at so many of the freedoms necessary for man to pursue and identify truth. It is difficult to determine truth, and we need the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and most importantly, freedom of religion in order to pursue truth. The founders knew that was so important that this was built in at the very beginning, and a turn away from that very much hurts intellectual freedom. I was reading one scholar who put it well: shouting down a speaker robs listeners of the opportunity to hear and learn, and robs the speaker of his own speech. A central reason to value open debate is its capacity to show us the truth, even if only by voicing errors that make the truth easier to apprehend. Free speech is central to political and moral reasoning in which citizens express their conclusions and weigh them against competing claims. If you believe in self-government, you need free speech for an informed populace that makes wise and prudential decisions. And that does mean that provocative and controversial thinkers need space to express themselves and to be spoken against. When you look at the progressive agenda, which is for many about elite bureaucratic control of the people, control of the means of determining truth is key for advancing their agenda. Keeping people from being able to practice their religion for real is key to the progressive agenda. Limiting the press, such as we saw with that Citizens United battle, where the government tried to keep people from publishing negative information about Hillary Clinton. I think people forget the Citizens United ruling was really about whether you had the right to publish critical information, a critique of Hillary Clinton prior to an election in which she was running for office. And the government argued that you should not have the right to do that, which is just amazing. And of course, limiting discourse that we see in the culture is all part of this same task. I mentioned about the time that we spent at Hillsdale, and when I first arrived on campus, John Miller, who heads the journalism program, was giving me a tour, and I asked him to explain to me a little bit about the dress code that students are required to follow. And he said, "What are you talking about?" And coming from the University of Colorado, where I remember one of my fellow students won a contest. The contest was, can you wear the same outfit every day? He could. It was really disgusting by the end of the year. Sorry, every day for a full year, and he did it. He was wearing like really nasty shorts and a sweatshirt, and he wore them every day for a year. So when I think of college dress code, that was more my experience. And here I am on Hillsdale, and the girls are wearing these lovely dresses and pumps, and the men are wearing suit jackets, and they're all just so adult-like. And John Miller explained to me that there is no dress code at Hillsdale. They do that voluntarily. And I think it shows something very important about the students at Hillsdale and how they are treated. And it relates to how they read before you discuss things with them in class, which is they're not infantilized like so many students at so many colleges are. When all that talk about microaggression, safe spaces, acquiescence to feelings, it isn't just the university's fault, by the way. It's also a result of the decline of family size and the resultant helicopter parenting that we've witnessed in recent decades, these bubbles of protection for students. But if you treat students like children, they'll act accordingly, and they do. You probably heard the story a couple years ago about how some office at Yale University's Intercultural Affairs Committee put out a memo asking people not to wear offensive Halloween costumes. Don't dress up as a Native American. You might offend a Native American. Don't dress up as a pirate. You know how pirates get. They're very sensitive. And this Yale faculty member named Erica Christakis sent an email in response which said, "Have we lost faith in young people's capacity, in your capacity, to exercise self-censure through social norming, and also in your capacity to ignore or reject things that trouble you?" It's a good question. She meant it actually rhetorically, but it turned out that they had lost faith in young people's capacity, and she and her husband, who are both working at the university, were bullied. She ended up being forced out of her job. The university did not punish the students who were screaming at her and her husband or bullying them. They, in fact, responded by allocating $50 million in diversity training or something to that effect. And my favorite thing is that Erica Christakis was called a housemaster, which is like a leadership position at Yale. They renamed the masters because they, of course, as you know, clearly it's a racist term. Unless you know Latin, even a little bit of Latin, where master comes from magister, meaning teacher. So they really showed the Latin people who's boss there. And of course, nobody knows Latin, so the only possible explanation for why you'd be called a master is racism. So they changed it to something else. I don't know what they changed it to. But that was the actual response from Yale, when the response should have been exactly the opposite. There is some evidence that this isn't working out as well for universities as many in the media suggest it does. My husband, Mark Hemingway, has written a lot about the protests at the University of Missouri that broke out in 2015. They were originally related to Black Lives Matter, but then they became mostly about administration at the University of Missouri and worker benefits. There were hunger strikes, the football team struck, the football team did a boycott. A professor was caught on video encouraging violence against media that were covering the protests, literally. And the chancellor of Mizzou resigned. The president of the entire University of Missouri system also resigned. Spike Lee made a film about it. But it turns out that the way that people responded, the people in the real world responded to the University of Missouri, is that they received they expect an increase in enrollment. Instead, they got a 1,500 student drop in enrollment for the next year. They had to close 4 dorms the next year. By the end of the year, enrollment was down 6.1% from the previous year. They were projecting a 7.4% drop the next year. And it's just getting worse. They had to cut $55 million out of their budget to make up for the tuition shortfall, which they also responded to by increasing tuition, which suggests they maybe need to learn a little bit about supply and demand, but universities have stopped teaching economics in any way that makes sense a long time ago, so they can be forgiven for this error, I guess. But considering that the initial protests were about worker benefits, it's also worth noting that they had to lay off 400 university employees, which is not also bad because, as I think we know, a lot of administrations are so bloated administratively. They have over 13,000 full-time employees at Missouri, 1 for every 2 students, or a little bit more than 2 students the next fall. This other professor, William Deresiewicz, wrote a piece for the American Scholar about teaching at a woman's school recently where speech was stifled. He begins his piece by talking about a young student who says she quickly figured out that she had to hide her Christianity from students and faculty. And it really got him thinking about the climate at liberal universities. At one point, he notes that the schools are really religious institutions, not Methodist or Catholic, but that they are designed to protect the religion of the elite, sort of a religion of success. And he says the link with political correctness, which isn't a natural link to that religious value of success, is a fig leaf to cover this sort of competitive individualism of meritocratic neoliberalism, which worships individual success above all. So this political correctness ideology provides a moral cover beneath which undergraduates can prosecute their careerist projects undisturbed. And he says between that groupthink and the radical individualistic success plan falls the actual core purpose of liberal education. That's what falls away. Inquiry into the fundamental human questions undertaken through rational discourse, which you don't get to do with the us talk of PC consensus, which is not about argument, or the them talk of vituperous rage, which dominates most of our media and social media. So lost in this new higher education religion is inquiry into the fundamental human questions. What shall we do and how shall we live? Those questions threaten the radical individual success religion and its values, and they threaten the certain, confident orthodoxy of political correctness. The core purpose of a liberal education, he says, raises the possibility that there are different ways to think, and that is threatening to the progressive agenda. Seems well put. There are various ways to respond, and a lot of conservatives have put a lot of thought into this. Stanley Kurtz writes about the free speech problem on campus, and I was reading a piece of his where he talked about his game plan for what to do, which is colleges and universities ought to adopt a policy on freedom of expression. And then they need to systematically educate members of their faculty to make sure that they understand these principles. And then they have a responsibility for assuring free expression, so they need to be held accountable when these things fail, and so on and so forth. But I'm also a bit frustrated by how long it can take some conservatives to wake up to the reality and the seriousness of what is going on. They know academia is a disaster, but people keep sending their kids to the same schools without giving them the tools before that they need to survive and thrive at those schools. Last week there was a small story that I still think was significant in Washington, D.C. The Atlantic Monthly claims to not be partisan and to have no clique. That's not actually true, but that's what they had been claiming up until last week. It has really no conservatives. It has two people it tries to claim are conservative, who occasionally wade into conservative, like the outer banks of a conservative ideology, David Frum and another guy there. But they hired Kevin Williamson, who had left National Review to go work with them. He's a belligerent Trump critic, but conservative and pro-life. And they fired him days later after an internal mob and external mob demanded it, and their cowardly editor, Jeffrey Goldberg, acquiesced. By the way, I was in Jeffrey Goldberg's offices. He's a very nice guy, and I was so impressed. He had this picture, he had a Charlie Hebdo poster in his office. And the idea is that he is someone who would withstand even threats of Islamist violence in defense of freedom of the press. And he couldn't even take a few days of Planned Parenthood bullying. So I really hope that he, at the very least, has taken down the poster, the Charlie Hebdo poster, just for his own integrities, for his own sake. But they got rid of Kevin Williamson, and it was in this context that the Twitter CEO pushed out that article about the left crushing the right. They have this idea, there is no need to debate or seek the truth or even compromise. Just crush the opposition and move on. And that is where we are now, and it's awful, and I think we should stop pretending it's not that bad. We should stop pretending it's acceptable. And as bad as things are now, yes, okay, great. As bad as things are now, people even 10 to 20 years ago, things were kind of bad on campus then too, but they were far more amenable to free speech at that time. So the decline is happening quickly. And I keep thinking, what's going to happen in 10 years when people come out of a climate in 10 years and they get control of all these institutions? It is going to be insanely awful even by today's standards. My colleague at the Federalist, Ben Domenech, wrote about this last week, saying, consider the major hires the Washington Post, New York Times, and the networks have made since the 2016 election. The additions overwhelmingly haven't been Trump fans. They have been different critics of the president and the administration, occasionally from a slightly more rightward position. Kevin Williamson was consistent with this. The point is that the audience, for all their airs about the diversity of viewpoints and how that's important, really just wants their existing views re-expressed to them in different forms and by different voices. If you get through the diversity veneer, you'll find the same rule: no wrong think can be tolerated. To these religious institutions of colleges and the media, constitutionalists and conservatives are abject heretics, and they treat us as such. It is time to stop trying to pretend that they are open to discourse, or that working with them is where you become like the one token person at their institution will affect the change that is necessary for the republic. For those with views placing them on the right, the only way to win, in my view, is to not play this game anymore. The only way to win is to build up our own platforms and institutions, our own Hillsdales, our own TV shows, our own publications. That's why my publication, The Federalist, exists. That's why Hillsdale exists. And I hope you all commit to recognizing the seriousness of the task ahead of us and the work needed to save the Republic and her values. And I'm very glad to be working with you all on this.
Thank you, Mrs. Hemingway. We now have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to be brought to you.
Hi, Bill Dedman. Jordan Peterson has come into the news lately with regard to a lot of the things you're addressing. I wonder if you have some comments on him.
So I am reading through his book, The 12 Rules for Living, is that what it's called, right now, and I'm enjoying it. I'm not like a complete fan of him, in large part because I myself am a Christian and I don't love his approach to Christianity, but I find him a really fun and provocative thinker to study. And I think what's interesting about him also is that he is having, people are responding to him and are being forced to respond to him because he's such a heretic. Heretics or dissidents can be really effective for influencing discourse. And he comes from liberal academic environment. He has, just through the course of his studies and his practices, come to realize that there are serious problems about the limits of free expression and how they threaten the survival of a free society. So I actually do think he's worth reading, not reading uncritically, but I think he is making an impact for a reason, which is that he's forcing some questions that people have to take seriously. And boy, do people find him frustrating on the left, which also can be, but they're sort of forced to engage with him and at least talk about where they don't like him, and that's a very helpful thing as well.
My question is, how can we consumers push back when we see the news media make egregious mistakes, like on the nightly news? It's either sins of omission or commission or both. I used to live in Chicago, and I wrote Dick Durbin because he didn't care what I said, but his 20-something interns might have learned something. So should I take any time and write NBC, CBS, all these guys and say, hey guys, you blew it? Or does it really not matter because they make money because the left people support their advertisers?
I'm not sure if I know the answer to the question, but I do think there is value in responding to false news that you see from media outlets. And I recommend doing it, like if people receive no pushback, they're existing in a lot of echo chambers where everybody affirms for them that the way they view things is correct. And when someone pierces through that bubble, it can be very effective. And I also think it's important when you're doing that you speak nicely and you don't allow them to tune you out, because I think it's very frustrating and I sometimes get filled with rage. Sometimes I watch things and I'm like, this is the worst thing I've ever seen, and I'm so angry. But before I write the note to the reporter and say, so by the way, when you made this factually incorrect statement, I would try and calm down so that I don't just say what I'm actually feeling. But I do think it's important for the bubble reason to remind people that the carefully curated home that they have made for themselves is not representative of the real world, and that is a good service you can provide to your neighbors. And journalists might be really frustrating, but they're still your neighbors. So.
My name is Mark Sabin. I'd like to ask you a question that goes back to what Cheryl Atkinson said in her talk this morning. And she talked about the curators and the question of the corporations controlling speech. There is now a law pending, I believe it's in California, where they now want to have a governmentally developed, sponsored control curator and force media to go through that control process to guarantee and determine what will be released or not. I'd like to know your thoughts on the idiocy of
I think this is something that people on the right need to really monitor and be careful about. One thing that was interesting, I love that she was giving this history of fake news, and it was so weird in the aftermath of the election. Anyone has to acknowledge that was a surprising election result, even for people like me who predicted it. I was still surprised because I'd kind of lost the confidence in my prediction at the end. But the way that people ran to this idea of fake news, it was so disorienting. Like, of course, that's not a real thing that caused the election of Donald Trump, but they're all pretending like it is. So what was their real game plan? And I think it does come down to control of information and the idea that if you can judge the right news as real news and the wrong thing as fake news, you get to control the information that people receive. And control of information is the way that totalitarian systems control the people. And it sounds dramatic, but it's obviously happening in social media. And I think we're going to quickly see that we are not well positioned to fight against it, and that conservatives have frequently had this idea that the only problem of censorship is if it comes from the government. And certainly governmental censorship is a serious problem. That's not the only way censorship can happen. And they need to be aware of what systems they participate in that limit expression and limit information. And I think part of that should be about when we get our news, we make sure that we are getting it from a good variety of sources, that we're seeking out and not just responding to what corporations have decided is okay. And that does take more work, and also maybe less, this is a total argument against interest because I run an online publication, but less information gathering online and more about getting your education through books, printed publication, and the like. But it's something that people really need to be aware of, that there can be serious problems of censorship that exist outside of a governmental system.
Hi, Fred Botcher from Colorado. And
Woohoo!
just wondering, you talked a lot about culture and the cultural rot and things that are going on. And you know, just living through the decades, you see things make a downturn and all that. Do you think that at some point there's going to be there's going to have to be a crisis point to bring things back, or do you believe that you know, through starting your own publications or institutions, you can make a gradual shift back to the middle or something like that? Do you think that's possible, or we're going to have to go through some kind of blood thing? And oh, by the way, is Laura Ingraham, is she going to make it?
Yeah,
she's going to be
she'll
okay?
make it fine. And I'm very proud of her and the company for not, like, letting the bullies determine content. I think that's a really dangerous path to go down, and I hope, I would like to see actually all media figures, whether they're on left or right, think through a little bit about corporate bullying and whether that's something that is such a good idea in the long run. So I think that it's a bit of an optimistic idea to think that a crisis point might arrive, and it's too optimistic for two reasons. One, it might never arrive, and also you don't know how things will actually go if a crisis comes along. So I mean, I think you can feel it in the air that there's some domestic conflict and there's international conflict, and certainly if something big happened there, all bets are off in terms of what happens in the future. And hopefully, what you should always be doing also in light of this, because you never know when conflict will come, is preparing for how to handle your way through conflict and how to make things better at the other side of that conflict. But because it might not happen and because it might not go the way that you like, of course the thing to do is to build up the institutions. What I'm a little frustrated by is how much people want to believe that the left is open to conservative viewpoints or open to conservative ideas, and they keep on trying to persuade. And I think that how many decades do these institutions have to tell you they're not interested before you realize, like, maybe this isn't the way to go, and why having strong institutions are so important. And because these other institutions on the left, the media and academia, are actually pretty weak, it is a great moment to build up institutions on the right. And we can learn from what they did well and avoid their errors. So I think that's far and away the best plan.
Well, I'm Bill Crow from Colorado, and as a new member of the Mollie Hemingway fan club, I'd like to ask you to put your crystal ball, or bring your crystal ball out and tell us what you think about the midterms coming up almost tomorrow.
So one of my things I do is I don't make predictions unless I really have a strong idea about it. It's very frustrating to be on Special Report because Brett Baer loves to surprise you with a quick question about what your prediction is about something that's going to happen. Now, when I make predictions, I'm actually pretty good. I mentioned that and this was not a common view out in DC. I thought Donald Trump would win the election, and I made that prediction in January of 2016, before he won the primary. I had a good understanding of that situation. With the midterms, I think people on the right are very right to be concerned, and I think that they have. I don't think that Republican elected officials have done a good job of managing the last year and a half. I don't think they've given enough victories to excite the base, and I think that they've also just done some really stupid stuff, like a $1.3 trillion spending bill. It kind of makes you wonder why you're voting for a Republican if they're going to do this anyway, and failure to push back against some progressive advancements, which is not to say, and people can get really down on Congress, they've actually done a lot of really good stuff too, and you know, Mitch McConnell has handled judicial nominations very well, and he'd handled them well going back into when Scalia died, which I don't think people remember how much pushback he got for his plan that he would not hold hearings on a nominee. And people lost their minds, and he was like, maybe you didn't hear me. we're not having hearings on the nominee. And they'd come up with all these reasons why you had to, and he was like, oh, I'm sorry, did you not hear me? No hearings, like, that's not going to happen. And that was one of the most important decisions that brought the presidency to Republicans, and he does not get enough credit for that. So I think people can get a little, they'd love to critique Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell. It's a very difficult caucus to manage. There aren't really good numbers there. So if you care about that party, what you should do is build up the numbers to give them some ability to actually push through legislation. But I think instead what's happened is they played it too safe, people are demoralized, and to say that the left is exuberant is a huge understatement. Like, all they've known since November 9th, 2016 was what they would be doing at the midterms. And they are very motivated and highly funded. So I think it's reasonable to worry about it. Having said that, people always make predictions early on, and there can be a turn of events that lead to wildly different calculus on the eve of an election, including a crisis point, a war with North Korea or something else, that causes people to sort of reorder what is their biggest incentive or what they're looking to do. So that was a really long way to say I don't know. Sorry.
I'm Lewis House from Louisville, Colorado.
Yay.
And for those who are not Coloradoans, it's not Louisville, okay? Question.
And it's great Italian food there.
There are many organizations that claim to be fact checkers.
Oh, thanks.
Now, the
Yeah.
question is, are there any that are legitimate and even balanced? And in particular, I'm interested in one called, I think it's ProPublica. Do you have comments on that?
ProPublica? Okay. I think what's interesting about the entire fact-checking genre is that it really arose out of liberal frustration that somehow George W. Bush got elected again, when they were like, but we've told people he's a bad guy, why did they not listen? And then this was the early version of fake news. Oh, they believed things were real when really we all know that George Bush is the worst liar in the history of all liars. And they wonder why their rhetoric against Donald Trump doesn't go over so well. But they built up this fact-checking empire based on their frustration that people were voting Republican. And I think it shows. Fact checks always go against Republicans. They fact-check opinion instead of facts. So they'll be frustrated that someone has an opinion that differs from them. And they will say, oh, technically it's true that the tax code is longer than the Bible, as Ted Cruz or someone said. But if you think about it in a different way, that's not really the way to put it. Well, that's not a fact check. That's whatever that is, that's not a fact check. And so they struggle with their own limitations that were cooked in at the beginning. Oh wait, I have to mention one of my favorite ones is they rated Carly Fiorina a liar because she published a book called From Secretary to CEO. But did you know that she didn't go straight from secretary to CEO? So she's a liar. And I think that the entire enterprise is rotten. That's my own personal bias. Wait, one more example is that they rated in 2013 Barack Obama's claim that if you like your health care plan, you can keep it. They rated that lie of the year. And people say, well, see, look, they go after Democrats. What they failed to mention is that PolitiFact judged that statement true 6 times during the actual time it mattered, when people were voting based on these things. And then many years later, they said, oh, it turned out that was a lie. It turned out that wasn't true. But they had given credibility to the statement when it mattered, only to backtrack later. So there's a news site, actually, we just talked about it on Media Buzz on Sunday, that analyzes fact checks and just kind of compares, like, are they actually checking facts or are they checking opinions? Or another favorite of mine, are they checking predictions? You cannot fact check a prediction because it's in the future. And looking at whether their sources for something are credible or not and how they go about their business. But just my own personal view is I just fundamentally reject the entire premise of fact-checking. Other people might get more value out of them. But.
We have time for one more question.
No pressure, but it should be a good question. Just kidding.
Thank you, Molly. My name's John Young. I'm from Littleton, Colorado. I wonder if you could comment on what things we can do as citizens to fight back against speech and the college campuses.
So I actually think that what's most important is in your own life to cultivate an embrace of free expression. And I thought about this with there was a story a few years ago with Brendan Eich, who was the CEO of Mozilla, and he'd given a small amount of money to a campaign to define marriage as the union of one man and one woman. And he lost his job, which was not just his job, he founded the company, and he was forced out. And because he refused to recant. And how easy would it have been with his empire to say, oh, I shouldn't have done that, or I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was hurting feelings or something. He refused to recant. He didn't say anything about it, but he just refused to do what you were supposed to do. I found this to be one of the most inspirational moments of the last decade. People responded to it by, like a lot of pundits said, good, he got fired, that's just the market doing its work. That would be sort of a liberal viewpoint. And libertarians said, or that was a libertarian viewpoint, the liberals said he should have been fired, he had the wrong ideas. And even like a lot of conservatives said, well, you should have the right to be wrong. But he was actually fired for being right. He was fired for saying something true. And his refusal to recant reminded me of, I was actually just mentioning this at lunch, Václav Havel has an essay called Power of the Powerless, I think it's called. It's colloquially referred to as the greengrocer essay, because he talks about how people put up signs in communist systems where they say, workers of the world unite. Nobody even knows what it means, but they know they're supposed to put the sign up, and it keeps the people above them happy and knows they can trust them, and it keeps the people below them confident that they can deal with them. And if someone refuses to put the sign in, it really disrupts the system. And so I think that a lot of what's happened at universities has happened because we ourselves self-censored, and we were afraid to say true things, and we care a lot about not offending people, which is a good virtue to be polite, but what we have lost is the fight for truth. And I think in our own interactions with our family members, our neighbors, and our colleagues, we need to make sure that we aren't losing that very American embrace of free expression, and that we also react with happiness to other people practicing that, even when we disagree with them, that we take the time to argue with them, and that we reinstill these values as a culture, and I think that will be the best thing we could do. And if you can't do that, if that's not your gift, I do think it's important to support those people that are doing it, and to make sure that those institutions and people who are out there publicly do get your support, which is good to do even if you're doing this on your own too. But that's my best advice for what to do. Thanks.